if you want fuller biographies of my husband, Bob just puts them on the tables, and if you want to know more, because we really do want to use the time that we have to engage in conversation. So I think that My Secret Country raises multiple questions and issues for the psychology of childhood play in general, and the creative impacts of play with imaginary friends and imaginary worlds in particular. And Marlo and I, maybe we should change how we're speaking. I don't know if it makes much difference. But Marlo and I will begin the conversation by considering My Secret Country as a catalyst for thinking about creative play, creative process, and creative collaboration. And then at some point we'll turn to Sandy and Marjorie, who will join our conversation with extended remarks about the film's remarkable capture of make-believe, particularly with imaginary companions and secret countries. And then we'll wrap up our part of the conversation by considering the role of creative play lifelong. And then we hope we're really going to save some time to ask you to join our conversation with questions or just additional comments that you might want to make. So we'll hold off though on taking questions from you until like the third or fourth part of our conversation, and I'll let you know about that. So I just wanted to start by congratulating Marlo. A marvelous documentary, I think. Marlo, you explore the pretend worlds of play among children and with the children. And I think that's uncommon and part of what makes this documentary so unique. You solicit expert opinion about creative play from adult experts, some of them sitting here today, and from the actual practitioners themselves who are actually practicing in situ or in medias res as they're playing. And you harness what is essentially private play to a cross-generational group collaboration that is also very unique. And I think the result is a documentary that is somewhat of a hybrid. I think you used that word too when you were talking to me about it. An exploration of imaginary friends and worlds that takes shape in the invention of an imaginary story world. So I just wanted to say bravo. Bravo, I think that's wonderful. So I wanted to start out by asking you about your hybrid creative journey over the years that you've been working on this project. But first, a few words about how we met, because that'll give people an understanding of how long you've been working on this. I remember I was still working on my book, which was, anyone wants to come look later, Inventing Imaginary Worlds, From Childhood Play to Adult Creativity. I was still working on that when you contacted me about this idea you had for a film about paracosm play, that is to say, play in a parallel world of imagination. And so this would have been something like 12 years ago, something like that. And as an independent scholar, I had been involved in research, in researching imaginary world invention because of my daughters, the Meredith in the documentary, my daughter's decade-long flight of fancy from the age of about 9 to 19 that she played in this place called Carland. And Carland had nothing to do with cars and everything to do with making things like language, a constructed language, maps, drawings, stories, poems, music, mathematics, and eventually saving animals from extinction. And she was, all the time she was doing this, immersing herself in creative process. So I remember you asking me about my creative journey, all the way from fascination with my child's play to studying MacArthur Fellows and others, all the way then to the technological impact of play, or the impact of technology on play in the age that we're in now. So that said, can you tell us a little bit about your creative journey over these, making this film?
Yeah, wow. So I did actually, I say it took 10 years because I count when I started filming Maxine. She was the first child I filmed. But really, you're right, the research process started with Marjorie and Michele, where I had reached out to both of you and you had kind of like put me on the right track. I'm like, I didn't know how to think about this or how to approach it. And so they were both really amazing, and just, I can't even tell you like how helpful you both were, like in your mentorship and guidance for me. but the story, like you need to be really obsessed with something that you spend 10 years on. So I was a child who had 3 like imaginary friends. I had a tiger, and I had a unicorn, and a winged unicorn, and I flew to a planet, and the planet was more like a person. That's like literally all I remember, but I think the obsession for me kind of came from trying to discover what was that about. I had some ideas, but I wasn't totally sure. And then I don't know if any of you have worked with like underserved youth, but I had worked with youth who were formerly homeless, and I was teaching them video. And I realized that one of their traumas was they were unable to imagine for themselves. Like they couldn't imagine being successful. They couldn't imagine having a loving relationship. They couldn't imagine, having their own apartment and being able to pay their rent. And just it like really struck me how important it is to be able to have this like staging ground in here and cue things up, and to believe that you can actually achieve your dreams. And so I think these things converged, and it just like ended up in this movie somehow. So we're here. Thank you for coming again.
Interesting how things get modulated in the mind and
Mashed
come
up in
out
the
in a way you
mind.
never expected.
Yeah.
So I think that the documentary offers a wealth of information about imaginative play of these 3 youngsters in early and middle childhood, Maxine, Dory, and Max. All 3 have imaginary worlds, and they have imaginary friends. And as I said before, tracking their play over a series of years is pretty remarkable. A little later, we're going to hear from Sandy and Marjorie just about how the film tells about childhood play, how much it tells. But I'd like to point out right now that, for me, one of the interesting things, too, is that the film explores a lot of issues in creativity studies, and particularly because of the way you frame the documentary in collaborative creativity. But, and we're going to hear about more of that later, because Marjorie's very interested in that as well. But I wanted to just ask you, where did you get the idea to play with the kids?
So the idea to play with the kids was from the kids. They're way more creative than me. It just, we were filming, and all of them were asking, so tell me about these other kids in the movie. And then one of them, I think it was Dory, she said, oh, wouldn't it be cool if my imaginary friends can meet their imaginary friends? And then I mentioned that, and then suddenly they were all like, oh my gosh, our imaginary friends have to meet. And so it was just really organic, and I was very nervous about that at first, but I decided to follow it.
Uh-huh. Okay, well, it worked. So I noticed that you and the children discussed characters and their quests, some of that language you used, and I noticed a lot of functional fairy tale tropes and things like that, such as portals that transported the imaginary friends. Did these story elements come about organically, or did you find yourself, as the adult or a more experienced partner, did you structure the story building, or did kids? Who had creative control of the evolving fantasy?
Well, as you can see, it's a little bit wild, and so as much as I could, I gave them control. So the whole story about dessert is written by them, and this idea of going through portals. Maxine had portals in her world, so that was just part of her imaginary friend world, where she had a billion imaginary friends, or maybe more. So that was there, and I don't know, everything was just, as much as I could, I gave over control of that part of the story to them. What I did inject was the inner critic, because for a while I thought that there was going to be another adult in the movie, and he was talking a lot about the inner critic. So I said, hey, could we inject this person who's thwarting your imaginary friends? And they agreed, and you can hear Dory in there running with that idea. She was like, yeah, and the inner critic hates dessert, so it was really, they just picked it up and adopted it in our storytelling sessions. And yes.
Yeah. Well, you almost answered. You answered half of my question. The next question was really about these also these things in psychology that are really the psychology of creativity that are very important, like the inner critic and the inner muse.
Yeah.
And I was interested where they came from. So you told us about the inner critic. Where did the inner muse come from?
So that's also right from the audio in there that you can hear Maxine, where she says, well, if we have an inner critic, why don't we have an inner muse? So that was a recording from our creative writing session. So I just took that and I was like, okay, so now we have an inner muse in the story. And that wasn't planned. It was just my commitment to following whatever they wanted to write in that, animated part of the movie, which is really about this is what's going on inside of their minds. And this is, a dive into what it might be like to experience an imaginary friend or an imaginary world.
Yeah. So my last question before I turn it over to Sandy is, imaginary worlds tend to persist for long periods in childhood and are often remembered in adulthood because they matter to the person who's playing. And for that reason, I found myself fascinated by the link between the playful quest for dessert and the children's discussion when a few years older of global warming and habitat destruction. Who introduced this connection? Or maybe I'm just not remembering, but did it come from the kids completely, or did you, or did they, or I think I asked you this before, or did you tell them about Meredith's work with the Wanakos, or what happened?
No, so the dessert going extinct, that was there. And then I was watching it, and because I had come from a background of environmental filmmaking, it did kind of hit me, oh, that's an interesting metaphor, but they probably didn't mean it that way. And then other people were watching rough drafts and they said that. And so when I went back to film them 5 years later, I asked them, what was this about? Why did you use the word extinction? And all of them, as you can see in the movie, they all said, basically the idea is that children today are really being taught about extinction of species or the planet and actions we might take to stop some of the destruction. So it's on their minds. And so that was definitely something, like Dory said, it was maybe subconscious. And you do see that, when Max had this issue where the explosion of the refinery right in his town, he turned it into his imaginary world and was processing it there. And so I think they might have really been processing their fears about what's happening to the planet or to animals in this way, and it just happened to be captured in this movie. At least that's what it sounds like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So my last point is you did take the children's imagination so seriously, for which I thank you. And I want to segue with that to Sandy's comments about childhood play, because of course she's been taking childhood play seriously for all her career too.
So let me just start by saying I love this film because it illustrates so much about pretend play that it's hard to communicate when we talk about it, but when we see it, it just makes it come alive. Just a few comments about pretend play. Pretend play is a creative act for children. It's a form of creativity for children. And we know that children who are creative in their play are also creative on other measures of creativity and are creative in other ways as they're growing up. And we also know that children who are creative in their play it is predictive of creativity, at least in high school, in terms of our research. So that ability kind of stays with them. I look at daily pretend play. I don't study imaginary friends. I don't study world play. And so I've thought about how does daily pretend play differ from the kind of play we see here. And it's not continuous, right? It's not as complex, although at times for some children it really is. But in general, I think daily fantasy play is responding to what's going on in the child's daily life, also what internal conflicts they have. And so in different ways, with different stories, with different characters, they act out what they're thinking about, what they're frightened about, what they're happy about. I thought Peter Gray in the film really did an excellent job of talking about emotion in children's play. I'm especially interested in their emotion. And, you know, he says one purpose of pretend play, it's kind of simulated emotion. And so they are simulating affect and working things out and dealing with their fears so that they can move on. And you could really see that here in so much of the play. So I wanted to focus on just some highlights that struck me as I watched this film that I was particularly impressed with. And first of all, you know, these characters are mental representations, mental images that are transitionary, that are transition objects for these kids. You know, we usually think of transitional objects as being real things, teddy bears, you know, that kids carry around with them. But these children just made them up in their heads at 3, I guess. 2 of them started this at 3. And they were able to do it with mental images kind of right away, and it soothed them. And that's the purpose of transitional objects, is to soothe the child, to give them comfort. And you could just hear how these characters worked in that way for these children. And also, they took such pleasure in talking about them, just such pleasure. And then Maxine made her dog into an imaginary friend, so that she could hold on to this dog. She knew he would die, and it was a way to hold on to him, which was just such a mature thing to do, you know. I was struck by the fact that all 3 of these children took a fearsome character, and made it friendly. So the main characters for all of them, first there was a devil man, but he was nice, right? He was a nice devil. He wasn't a scary devil. So there was a manipulation of this negative affect and making him safe. Squiggy, is it Squiggy?
Squidgy.
Squidgy. There was part dragon, but part turtle, part other stuff, and didn't breathe fire. Right, made it nice. And also, Vera, who was a vampire, but she was nice. And what did she want to do? She wanted to. She believed in life and happiness, right? She believed in life and happiness. So that these 3 important characters, there was a combination of fearsome, but also safe and soothing and helpful. They softened the image. And they also, it helped them deal, I think, with negative feelings. Dory said that her negative thoughts went into Vera's side. That these characters went through the same things that she did, and it made it easier, which was another purpose I thought that was so interesting. It's like she created her own support group, you know,
Wow.
Internal support group, and that these characters went through these things together. When they were older, the interviews with these kids 5 years later were it's so valuable to kind of hear how they're thinking about these worlds. And first of all, 2 of the older children now gave them up, right? They gave up these imaginary worlds and imaginary friends. So Maxine said one day, Devil Man was just gone. He was not in the lamp. And it was harder to feel connected to them. And Dory said they were not as interesting or fun, and she moved on. Max still he's only 10, so he still has him, right? He still has Squidgy. But Maxine, if you listen to what she said about how she thought about this world now, that it was part of the self that was built, and the thing dissolved, but was still part of the self. But it was manifested now in different ways into different things. So, and so when I think about children's pretend play where they don't have these worlds, but, the content is changing. It's not the content that stays with them, but it's the process, right? It's the processes that stays with them as they're getting older. Okay, 2 things that I loved, and then I'll ask you some questions. 2 things that I loved. I loved Maxine's parents because they gave Maxine the freedom she needed, and they said, you need to make a space for these children where they have freedom. And, it reminded me of Louisa May Alcott. If you visited Louisa May Alcott's house in Concord, where she grew up with her siblings, there was an attic. Has anybody been there? There's an attic where the 4 siblings, I think there were still 4 siblings, would go and dress up and play, and a huge fantasy world up there, huge. I mean, they still have the murals and everything. These parents created space for these kids, freedom and fantasy. And it also reminded me of a child I saw in therapy who came from a very poor background, lots of siblings. And early on in the therapy, when he had his toys, in the playroom, and a box, because these were to be his toys now, and a space for him, his affect, when he saw that he would have his own box and his own space, because he didn't have that at home. He didn't have that, and it was like his place where he could make his world now and do what he needed to do. Okay, and the other thing I really loved was this quote, Maxine, describing the imaginative process. So I went through it a few times to try to get the quote right. She was 7 when she said this, and her father, I guess, pulled out the phone and recorded it. So she was 7, describing this imaginative process. And it's a terrific description. She says, there are pathways in the mind. She gets lost in the mind. You think of something, you keep on getting deeper into the pathways. It's a mind adventure. I'm making up a story. You can do anything. It's all up to you, like you're in paradise. Paradise. And I thought, what joy, and what a beautiful description of free association, following your thoughts, in whatever you're doing, fiction, whatever, for lack of repression. Right? Basically, I'm psychodynamic, lack of repression. And if we could just help more kids get to that spot where they would be able to just follow those pathways and not get frightened, just a beautiful statement that I hope to quote in the future. It just sums it up.
She'll be very happy.
And my question's for you. Okay, when you interviewed them as they were older, did they talk at all about how having been in this experience affected them, influenced them? Did they say anything about that?
Well, when they were older, they all said they barely remembered. So
Being in it?
they barely remembered being filmed, or like what they made up in the story, and so that was a little bit like, oh, let me play this clip for you and jog your memory.
That's interesting.
But I'd love to pull out what you were just talking about. I had never thought of it this way. About them turning things like a devil into a good thing. And it's kind of like expanding my perception right now, because isn't that so true to what we go through if we're healing? Like, we have to make the parts of ourselves that feel ugly okay again. And I'm like, I can't even believe like how they just do it so naturally. It's just another gift from them. Thank you for pointing that out.
I think
I
they
don't
can
know.
do it because they don't know they're doing it. You know, it's pretend. They don't know they're doing it.
Yeah.
So it's, in a sense, it's easier for them to do it.
I hope they keep it with them.
Yeah.
Um,
And my other question, did they give you feedback? Did they give you feedback on the art? Have they seen it yet? And what did they think of the art?
Yeah, so the art, that was a completely collaborative process. So Maxine drew all of her artworks. Obviously Meredith, she had drawn those. Dory and Max, we worked with an illustrator, and so we were doing things like, I need to find a castle that looks sufficiently spooky, and we'd go online and I'd give her like 10 examples. No, that's not right. Or I'd like, oh, it needs to have this thing in the front, and this like gate. And so it was very, very, it took very long. Like everything had to be approved by them because I don't know what their world looks like. I wanted it to be as authentic as it could be. So they saw all of the stages of the process of the art, and then, you know, when they finally saw a rough draft, there were no surprises because they had signed off on everything. So this was really, that's partly why it took so long. It was just like, you have to wait. Like I need Milu's bark. She has a weird bark. You got to find her bark on your phone from like 5 years ago. We're not happy with this bark. We need to find another bark, Marlo. Okay, I've got time. At some point, I was like, that's all right. It's gonna. You know what? It's fine. But yeah, so it was a great process, though.
Have they seen the film?
Yeah, they have.
Okay.
But they haven't seen it with the new audio and the new color. And the audio, I really think, you know, the team did an amazing job, especially. So I'm excited for that.
So now I think it's time to turn to Marjorie and have her tell us a little bit about imaginary companions and imaginary worlds and how she's responding to the film.
Well, I want to congratulate you, Marlo. It was amazing, and I know it was a really long, difficult journey. It took much longer than you expected or wanted to, but that turned into a major strength because you get those wonderful interviews with the children as they're reflecting on what they did when they were younger, and I think that's such an amazing part. So it really worked out so well. It's awesome.
Thank you.
So most of my research is on imaginary friends, but I was inspired to do some research on paracosms some years ago by a parent who came up to me after a talk to ask me a question about her child's behavior. And I mean, this happens a lot. Parents want to know, okay, here's what my child does. Is that, you know, do other kids do that? Is it common? Is it normal? I mean, they want sort of a reassurance. And this mother came up and said that her son did not have an imaginary friend, but he was very into an imaginary world that he had created that was called Abixia. And Abixia is a country on a planet far from Earth. It's inhabited by soldier cats. And this boy had created many maps of the geography, had written a history, he had started a religion, he was working on a language, he composed a national anthem, he had designed a flag. I mean, it just went on and on. It was so incredible. And he would incorporate things from his life into his paracosm. So he was very into Swiss Army knives. And so Swiss Army knifology was the major at the University of Abixia, the most common major. And he also had part of the creation story of the religion involved Swiss Army knives. He talked about how a god named, it was actually a horse god, named Ott, had used a special attachment of a Swiss Army knife to carve out Abixia. And so Swiss Army knives were sacred, and the Abixians often wanted to do pilgrimages to Switzerland to get them and bring them back to Abixia. But Abixia set in the 1940s, and that's a problem. They don't have the technology. But this boy's best friend had an imaginary world named Rontuia, also inhabited by soldier cats. But it was set in the future, and so they had the capacity for interplanetary travel. So it could potentially help the Abyxians, but the problem was that the Rontuians did not like the Abyxians. In fact, there had been an Abyxian-Rontuian war, and the peace was still uneasy, and there were skirmishes and arguments, and actually other children were involved. There were about 5 or 6 kids that would get together to work on their imaginary universe. They all had imaginary worlds, and this was a very intense experience for them. There were treaties, there were skirmishes, there were alliances, there were betrayals. The emotions ran really high, tears were shed, friendships were strained. And so the mother says, well, is this normal? So I thought, well, gee, I don't know. I had always assumed, I come across paracosms because children, when they're interviewed about imaginary friends, sometimes bring them up. But I had assumed it was pretty rare. It seemed such an elaboration, and I didn't know if it'd be private. I just was, wondering about that. But after hearing about these 2 planets with soldier cats, I thought, I need to learn some more about this. How often do children do this? Seriously. So we started interviewing children about imaginary worlds. We've conducted 3 studies, and we've interviewed over 230 children. And what we found consistently is about 17% in all 3 studies, even though different populations, about 17% of the children told us about imaginary worlds. Now, sometimes, the 17% doesn't include the children who said, yes, I love the Harry Potter books, or yes, my family went to Italy last year. It doesn't count. It has to be like you saw in this film, like Abyxia and Rontuia. And actually Dory, who created Versailles, she was one of the participants in our research. That's how we met Dory and then introduced her to Marlo. So that 17% of the kids are doing things that are that elaborated. So we were surprised. We thought that was a substantial minority. Many of the children had imaginary friends, not all of them. Sometimes the imaginary friends lived in the imaginary world, not all of them. Sometimes it was really a distinct content. So we wondered, well, what are the characteristics of kids with paracosms as compared to children who don't engage in this kind of play? And actually, there were a lot of things that were surprisingly the same. So working memory was the same, verbal comprehension was the same, and even the most commonly used test of creativity, they didn't differ. So the uses test, the unusual uses test, where you ask a child, how many different things can you do with something like a paper clip? The children who had paracosms didn't differ from other kids on that measure. But where they did stand out consistently across the studies was in storytelling, the creativity of their stories. And it's pretty obvious from that film that you see it there. But our story task was we would start a story and ask the children to finish it. So we'd tell them, okay, there's 2 little kids, they're walking in the woods, and oh look, there's a key on the ground, and there's a door over there, and let's see if it fits, and okay, now it's your turn. Tell us what happens next. And we found that the children who had paracosms, they completed the stories in ways that were rated later by adults as more original, more interesting, more creative than the other kids. So I think that that's the narrative of their ability to come up with the narrative is really outstanding, and practice probably in having a paracosm. We're also interested in the social context. You think that a child in the imaginary world, is it private? Well, a lot of children really share it. About 40% of the paracosms that we investigated were shared with other children, with siblings, kind of like Abyxia and Rontuia. But what we often found was there was conflict in that sharing. So children like to have creative control over their imaginary friends. They like to have creative control over the narrative of their paracosm. And so they would argue about it. They would have fights about it. They would, there was conflict. And so for me, when I'm watching this film and seeing how they're working together so beautifully to come up with a storyline, did they argue at all behind the scenes? Like, was one child taking the lead and the others were, sort of convinced to go that way, or how did you scaffold it to avoid the fights that I have seen, in the creative control?
So I didn't even know that happened. I think partly it was a little bit of luck, but also it was maybe timing because Dory and Maxine, I caught them both kind of at the end of their imaginary worlds and friends, and they were kind of transitioning into letting them go. And so I think they were at a stage where they just weren't as tied to them. But yeah, it was just like pretty easy. Maxine came up with the idea of dessert going extinct, which you heard. And she was older, so she did kind of take the lead. But Dory and Max also had a lot of ideas, and I don't know, they were just really collaborative. I think they might also just be really collaborative people generally. So I didn't realize how much I was lucky, but it was just, they were all just so, yeah, it was really like a dream working with them. So
yeah, it's interesting. That was an interesting part to me. The other question I had for you, so today in Ashland, the film It is opening. You've heard about it, I bet you've heard about it because they, if you haven't, they really tried to make you hear about it. Hear about It everywhere. It stands for Imaginary Friend. It's a big movie that's opening nationally, but it's not the only movie. This year, like there are at least, like 5 movies featuring imaginary friends are happening. One of them opened a month ago or so. It's called Imaginary, and it's a horror movie. I went to see it, me and 3 other people, who was in the theater, and I don't recommend it because it's really, but it's amazing to me right now that there's all this interest in imaginary friends, imaginary worlds. The movie Imaginary also had an imaginary world, but the children being sucked into it, never to return, that kind of thing. This is part of the horror narrative, but why now? I mean, you're lucky in that you've been working on this a long time and it's coming to fruition just when there's a lot of interest. But why does that happen, that suddenly there'll be a surge of interest in this and then, then it's gone?
Yeah, I was thinking about that, and I realized there are so many projects that came out at the same time. I should probably make a list, but like, this could be a PhD, heads up, if you know anyone looking for a topic. But I from my perspective, like, I think that, I really do think, there is this like creative river that we all dip into, and if you have a similar perceptional viewpoint on the world, you're going to pull down, imaginary friends, and so certain people will do that, and then a certain amount of those people will take action on it. So it's just like, I think we're just all wired together, just like plants. We've just discovered, plants actually communicate under the earth. I think that's true for us. Anyone who's been in a long-term marriage knows you become telepathic with your partner. This is a real thing, like it. There's something going on there. I don't know, we're gonna discover it. But also the pandemic, right? There's something about reality. Like our perception of reality is shifting. We can remake reality like that, and we know it now. I don't know, there's something in there. What do you guys think?
Well, I'm wondering about the audience. I think it's time.
Well, yeah, we could start that, and then maybe at the very end, I have one question for you all and us too to think about. We'll get it will be our last question, and that is, how important do you think it is that we maintain our ability to play into adulthood? And if it is important, how do we go about doing that? But that'll be our last question. So you can think about that a little bit while we take questions. So I think someone in the back had a question first. Maybe it was you, yes. Maybe it was you, yeah, I guess.
Okay. So in the last 5 years, there's been this explosion of research into understanding how we visualize in our mental world. So there's this spectrum of fantasia between people who have aphantasia, that means they have like no ability to visualize in their mind's eye, and then people who have hyperphantasia, who can literally watch a movie once and remember every single frame. Wow. And like most of us fit somewhere in the middle. So Ed Catmull is an example of somebody famously who is aphantasia, who has aphantasia, and he started Pixar. So someone who like essentially completely changed how we see imaginary worlds on screen does not have a visual ability to even visualize a sphere, for example, in his mind's eye. And it made me wonder, as you were talking to these children, if you got a sense of whether this same type of spectrum is represented in how they visualize their imaginary friends, or is that something that happens later on in development? I mean, talking to Ed, it seems like he was never able to do that, but it made me wonder if you see in these kids a difference in terms of literally how they visualize these imaginary friends.
Oh, wow. So I know for Dory, she said she does see it like a movie. So I have a feeling she's like really far in the opposite end of the Pixar guy. Yeah, we talked about that. It's just like literally like a movie, and she would stand in her room and act it out and voice the characters, and her mom was like, what's going on in there? For the other two, they're probably like more in the middle. I mean, I definitely like, you know, they drew, like Max had drawings of Squidgy that he wasn't happy with, so he didn't want in the movie. But, and Maxine, you saw what she's drawn there, and she had a whole bunch of other characters like that weren't even in there because you can't, she had like so many. But they were very visual, so that's interesting. I never thought of that. It's, I don't know if that answers your question though.
So
but
I could say something about that. We actually were interested in children with imaginary friends use visual imagery more or had more vivid mental imagery, and I would say not necessarily, because some of them are extremely vivid, but other children, if you ask them, can you see her the way you see me? They'd say, well, she's invisible. Like, what's your problem? You know. So I think you do see the range, and the children, you know, they manifest, the imaginary friends manifest in different levels of visual complexity.
fascinating.
How about here? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering, just from the whole panel, it's like the kids that have imaginary friends, how much of it is the environment void or more restricted of distractions? As compared, you know, internet, electronic stuff. They're more, have to be more reliant on their imagination.
Well, they watch less television. We know that from research by the singers. They found that children with imaginary friends watch television less than other kids. And I think that the singers also talked about how you have to have unstructured time. If you're never alone and you never have unstructured time, if you look at a screen every time you've got nothing to do, that's not conducive to this kind of play. So I think
Yeah, you have to have time to be bored.
Yeah, that's right. You have to be able to
Time
get bored and figure it out.
so that you'll actually have an impetus to do something. And I just want to say that part of the work I did when I was working on this topic was I interviewed a bunch of kids who were in their teens, mid-teens, about their play with computer games in computer game worlds. And because I was thinking, well, you know, with kids all of a sudden, in my lifetime anyway, all of a sudden now they had this new way of playing, and how was it going to change their imaginative adventure? And I just remember one kid, he played, I forget the name of the program or the game, but there was a kind of a game where you could make up, maybe it was like this, a life game. You made up the characters and you took them through their daily whatevers. And he used the structure of the game, off the net or whatever, to play his version of, you know, instead of drawing them or whatever, he would use the game. So he was able to do that, and so I think that might work for a lot of kids. On the other hand, other kids might just be drawn into whatever the dominant scenario and narrative is that the adult wrote into the program, and they'll play in there. So I don't really know where technology brings us, but it's going to be a little different.
But we know that it's reduced the time that children play on their own in an unstructured way. The time for that kind of unstructured play has really been reduced.
Yeah.
And Jonathan Haith's new book, can't remember the title at the moment, just came out.
Anxious generation.
That's it. Really talks about, you know, as he's problems increase, play has reduced significantly, and it's a real problem.
How about back there? Go ahead. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I sort of follow up to the discussion that's unfolding. Kind of a counterpoint I'm curious about because I wonder if there are paracosm elements to things like using the internet and computer games. I believe there are scenarios or instances where it is rather unstructured, but it's not seen. This is not like the interface analog. But just from experience of growing up with 3 younger brothers, and before computer games were available, and then after they were available, they 3 of them really got into it. So I was kind of like sort of booted out of that in their imaginary space, but in watching them grow with it, there were games they choose that were more like they can control what they do with it. Sort of like I think it's Sims was
Probably Sims, yeah. Yeah,
Right.
thank you, yeah.
But,
Minecraft.
So observing them, and the oldest that I can converse with now, a lot of his favorite games are more what's called the sandbox game, where there's less structure
Yeah,
from
Totally.
the game, but you can borrow like
right.
elements of features too. So I was just wondering, is that a proper application of the paracosm concept, or is there more looking to understand?
That's a good question. I mean, I guess it depends on how strict you want to be about your definition of a paracosm. But I would think that if the child has significant creative input and it accumulates, and they might get interested in documenting it in some way, whether it's saving the program or whatever, then I think you're getting very close to what world play is.
It's just an interesting comment to see, like, the 2 probably most popular games now for kids are Roblox and Minecraft.
Yeah.
And both of those are about creating your own world. And they dwarfed, in terms of their share of the industry, all the games where a kid just plays and, is kind of passive about it. I think that's really fascinating. Because essentially what it's allowing these kids to do is create these imaginary worlds and then share them with their friends. And,
Yeah, actually, I thought with technology and the way there are all sorts of platforms where you can go and, I don't know what the word would be, insert all the data about your world. There are lots of opportunities now for people, not just children, but adults as well, to play in these worlds and create worlds. And I think there's a lot of that activity out there, so, yeah.
Yeah, I want to raise the issue for you about, and me and us, about pathology. And that's not because I think there's any pathology here at all, but I think creativity can deal with this as well, where because something is exceptional or different, it's seen as not a good thing. And I thought I was seeing this here. First of all, whoever said support group, it may have been you, or Sandy, I'm not sure. But it really felt like these kids were very good at having their support groups, whether inner or outer. So even Maxine was saying it's better not to be an only child. But I mean, I'm talking about people saying, oh, that's weird. And that may be happening less with some of these games and other things. But, or RPGs, which my daughter did at one time, where you were role playing with people around the world. Yeah. But the one thing I found the most moving in this whole film for me was at the end when the rubber ducky came down. And this was the third ingredient. They have the joy and the things they wanted, the sprinkles, that mountain. But if there were a problem, you would ask for the rubber ducky. So Sandy, I am getting psychodynamic here. That it seemed that, it seemed that the worst thing could be if you weren't listened to. That's how I heard that part. If you weren't listened to by the adults, if you weren't believed, or you were put down like the bad, bad, bad. This is my take on it. But it was very moving to me, at least as my take on it. And that I also liked that it may have been Maxine wanted to invite the goblin for tea. So it wasn't all about the bad guys or the bad guys. It was like, how can we make this a better world? But it seemed like if worse came to worse, there was always the rubber ducky. Now I associate that with little kids having a bath. But also you can always regress because I can't hear them as well, but that means they're still there. That's, you know, agree or disagree, but I love it. Thank you. It was a wonderful documentary.
Oh, thank you for watching.
Any other questions?
I have a question. I was surprised at how self-aware some of the children were, and the fact that the play that they're engaging and imagination that they're doing is a coping mechanism. So I was just wondering if that's a common thing among the population of the kids that you study.
So your question is whether it's that that self-awareness, being able to reflect on the process is that common? I would say no. I think you got lucky there, but it's definitely related to coping. So I can speak to that a little bit. So we were interested in whether having an imaginary friend was a sign of pathology, which we didn't think was true, but or if it actually, if you are in trouble, if it could contribute to resilience, which is what Dorothy Singer would say. So we looked at older kids because we wanted to see, okay, sometimes people will say, it's okay if you're 5, but what if you're 12 and you have an imaginary friend? And there's a lot of negative feeling about that. So we thought, well, let's look at these older kids and let's find the kids who are definitely already in trouble and see if having an imaginary friend is a predictor of resilience or it's the first stage of going down the drain in their life. And so we piggybacked onto a study of over 1,000 children who in a school district, and focused on 150 of them who were picked by their parents as least likely to succeed, essentially. They were 12, they were already getting into a lot of trouble in school, they were failing, their families were in deep trouble, their parents, you know, their father was in jail, their mother was an addict, all these things were going on. And we wanted to see, first of all, how many of them have imaginary friends, and we found that a number of them did, like about 11% of them had imaginary friends. So the question was, what happens down the road? So we, at age 18, so they're 12 now, we looked at age 18, and to be considered to have done well in this population, you had to finish high school, no history of drug abuse, no history of a police arrest, and no diagnosed mental illness. And what we found was the children who had had imaginary friends at age 12 were much more likely to meet that criteria. So in general, these kids weren't doing so well, but the kids who had imaginary friends at age 12, it was a clear sign of resilience. So it's a coping thing. If something's going wrong in your life, if you're little, like, you know, you don't have a lot that going for you, but you do have your imagination. It's a very powerful tool to help you conquer the challenges that you have in life.
Yes, and we also find that children who are creative in their pretend play also can think of more coping mechanisms in a particular situation. So they can think of more things to do, which is probably because of the divergent thinking ability. And in one study, we found that they did better in a dental situation. They were less distressed after having a Novocaine. The good players were less distressed.
Now we actually found, we asked kids, think of all the ways that you could solve the problem of being a new kid in school and trying to make friends, and the children who had paracosms were better able to come up with creative solutions than the other children. So the social creativity was really what we found, that when it came to things that were non-social, they just didn't look different on the various measures. But when it involved social content, then we often found that they did better.
Well, I think that brings us almost to the end. So that question about, you know, and I want to ask Marlo first that question about how important is it to play and how important is it to keep playing as we get older. What do you think, Marlo?
Since making this film and just being with the children all these years, I'm totally in touch with my inner child, and it's part of my meditation practice. I'm not kidding. I make sure to check in, because when I do, my day is way better, because I'll be like, look at the clouds, or, oh my God, the flowers. And even if I'm stressed out, there's a part of me that's like, whoa, look at that outfit, or, it's like always able to have fun with my life, and my life is so much better. So for me, I'm just like, I am very invested in this idea.
Yeah, well, you certainly make a very strong plea for it, I think, in the documentary comes through. I
Yeah.
love that quote from you saying, the mind is a sacred canvas that calls us to create. Yeah, but the question is, how do you keep playing? Do you both think we should keep playing as adults, and how do we do that?
You have to find things that you can engage in that keeps those processes going, right? That you get into the flow, that you're having fun, that it's pleasurable, that it's keeping the daydreaming aspect of pretend play going, that you're keeping that going. It helps if you have some talent in whatever it is you're going into, maybe not. But I don't think it's the same. I don't think it's the same as the pretend that the 7-year-old does. But those processes you engage in as an adult, and it's important to do it.
Well, I think that Maxine was the one who really summed it up. She talked about how she didn't do the paracosm anymore, but she did other things now. It had changed.
Right.
It's still that creative spirit, but we're not going to play like we did as children. But I think that adults are extremely playful. They're certainly engaged in fiction of all kinds and fantasy. So I'm not too worried about the play for an adult.
You're not too worried.
No.
How about anyone from the audience have a thought about how we keep playing, or should we? Mm-hmm.
I like something that one of the kids said, that you just have to start somewhere. When she was writing her story, you start. So I have been trying that. I don't know what is exactly what I want to do in my next phase, so I just have been trying things and experiencing different things. I hope that'll be good for her.
Yay!
I'll just final end here. Yeah, I think we should keep trying to play. That's one of the reasons I'm very interested in avocations and avocational creativity and what that can do for us in our whole lives. And I don't think you necessarily have to have talent, as long as you have interest and drive and fun. You're having fun. But I did want to say that Marlo and I are going to run a short hour workshop on Saturday about inventing imaginary worlds. So if you want to come and play with us, we'd love to see you. I think it's at 11 o'clock on Saturday.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.